I'm Jason Alicea. I am a professor at Caltech in Pasadena, California. I'm a theoretical physicist. I study exotic manifestations of quantum mechanics in materials and other systems that are composed of many particles. A lot of times I'm interested in just understanding new basic phenomena, but sometimes what I do is geared towards identifying future technologies that harness quantum mechanics in interesting ways.
Yeah, that's really cool. So, how did you get interested in research in the first place?
Kind of by accident, actually. So I started college. I was a student at University of Florida many years ago. When I entered college, I thought I was going to be an engineering major. I assumed that I would spend 4 years in college and then become gainfully employed, and that would be the end of my education. But around halfway in, I began to have second thoughts. Actually, it was in the second year of college. I was forced to take physics classes. I didn't really even know what physics was about pretty much in those days. It was very difficult, actually. The first physics classes that I took, actually, it was the hardest class that I ever took at the time. I had to work very hard. I did extra problems and so on. I realized that I needed to rewire my brain to think like a physicist, but I kind of figured it out by the end, and the hard work paid off. So I think it was maybe a year after that that I decided, okay, I'm probably going to switch to my major from engineering to physics. And I knew if I was going to make that switch, I would want to do research. And so my whole future trajectory was upended at that point because I knew if I did physics, I would probably want to get a PhD and do research. But I didn't really know what research was like until I tried it. And I tried it as an undergraduate. And I guess the latter half of my undergraduate years, I did research. And I really liked it. It was really rewarding, really cool to see how it feels to discover something that no one has ever before you in the history of humanity realized. Then I mean, my decision was made at that point once I realized that I enjoyed doing research and went to graduate school, and the rest is kind of consistent with what I was intending to do.
Yeah, that's really nice. And then I know that you kind of went over it already, but in terms like understandable to a high schooler, could you tell me a little bit more about the research that you do?
So quantum physics is often viewed as kind of polar opposite of classical physics. Classical physics like mechanics, force laws, and things like that. That maybe if you had a good physics education in high school, maybe those things are familiar. Newton's laws and classical electricity and magnetism. These are tried and true theories that are responsible for lots of technologies that completely changed the world as we know it. At some point, in the 1900s, people realized that that was not the theory of everything. If you want to, let's say, understand even the existence of an atom, the usual laws of classical physics don't allow you to understand why an atom is stable. And so quantum mechanics is the domain that is absolutely essential for understanding very small scale things, not things that we perceive with our common experience. But if you want to understand very small scale properties, you unavoidably have to use quantum mechanics. It's a beautiful, highly successful theory that, at least for the purposes of things that we see, existence of matter and things like that. Quantum mechanics is sort of the theory of everything that we ever deal with on a daily basis at a very fundamental level. What I think about are situations in which quantum mechanics, this funny theory that is so successful at describing, let's say, very small scale things. I'm interested in situations where quantum mechanics is important also for larger scale things. When you have many atoms making up, let's say, macroscopic material, it turns out that quantum mechanics can also play a role in governing even large scale collective behavior of those systems. And that's what I aim to do usually. Sometimes as a theoretical physicist, I don't do experiments. I think about logical possibilities, what kind of phenomena are possible, how you can detect them in nature, how you might be able to realize interesting large scale manifestations of quantum mechanics. How do you take advantage of those things for technology, things like that. And sometimes I would work with experimentalists who are actually doing measurements, and we team up and try to do something that neither of us could do on our own.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I
Thanks.
know that like quantum physics is known for being like really challenging, but like what are some of the like biggest obstacles that you faced in research and how did you overcome them?
Research is a very funny thing because you spend almost all of your time being confused, but it's like a puzzle. You're trying to solve a puzzle. If you like puzzles, and it's a larger scale puzzle, you're trying to figure out some truth about nature, or maybe trying to understand some measurement that somebody made, some observation that's out there that's crying out for some interesting interpretation. And so you have to become comfortable with not knowing what's going on and a lot of uncertainty, because a good research project should have maybe a clear start but not a clear end. You might not, or even a clear middle. You have to kind of figure out where you're going as you kind of progress. One thing that I remember not liking when I was younger, let's say in middle school, high school years, is the way the process of science was taught to me. So I don't know if this is still taught, but I learned about the scientific method as this very rigid kind of series of steps, hypothesis and so on. But that's not the way it is in practice. As a practicing scientist, I can say that I couldn't even tell you the steps of the scientific method because it's a much more nebulous thing, the way we proceed. So it's not a regimented thing. There's lots of just following your nose and trying to follow your intuition. It's a very social thing too. There's lots of, a big part of my job is just talking to people and having interesting conversations at the blackboard and trying to get unstuck and figure out where you're going. Yeah, so that's the tricky thing. You have to become comfortable with this natively uncomfortable feeling of being confused and not knowing maybe where things are headed. But there's a big payoff that comes at the end of that, which is when you finally do figure out, what you were trying to understand. It's a wonderful feeling. It's a great feeling of accomplishment. And it's, again, like the feeling of solving a puzzle that's really hard to solve. There's technical things also. If you're trying to push the frontier of what humanity knows, by definition, it's going to be hard. Everything is going to be hard. There's maybe some lower hanging fruit than others, but the whole thing is hard. If it wasn't hard, then it kind of by definition, it would have already been done by somebody else. Yeah, it's all difficult, and you have to, be comfortable with, let's say, maybe high level math in some cases, or maybe computer programming. There's a lot of writing that's involved in communication. You have to kind of be a jack of all trades, and to me, adds to the fun of it. It never gets boring because the job is constantly changing, even from one week to the next. What you're spending your time on can be very, very different, but at the same time, that's another sort of challenge because you have to just be able to do many different things and cope in different modes of operation.
And then on like the other hand, what do you enjoy most about your research?
I really enjoy working with other people, which is maybe, I don't know if this is a common misconception, but I don't think that I appreciated how interactive the process of scientific discovery is. A huge fraction of my time is spent just talking to students or other collaborators. It's really fun. And when you have a group of people that are all really excited about some scientific question, it's a thrilling experience.
Yeah, okay. And then which person or mentor in your field has made the biggest impact on you?
I'd say that has to be my PhD advisor. So his name is Matthew Fisher. I was a graduate student at UC Santa Barbara. I came in basically wanting to work with this person, Matthew, for a couple of reasons, actually. He came highly recommended. He had a very good reputation as doing very interesting things. And when I met him for the first time at a conference, actually when I was still an undergraduate, he was just very down to earth, easy person to interact with. So I took away a lot from him, not only about, what kind of science is interesting. And, it's a matter of taste that everyone has slightly different tastes from, but, you kind of naturally soak up enthusiasm about certain things from your mentors. And I certainly did that from Matthew. But also just, as a person, he's, very, very close, like a member of my family nowadays. So yeah, he was a big influence on me, not just as a scientist, but also just as a person, which actually speaks, I think, to the other, to what I was just saying before. One of the best things about research is the interactive nature and the bonds that you develop with other scientists. It is kind of like you're enlarging your family in a way by the people that you spend lots and lots of time talking with and getting to know in the process of doing interesting.
Yeah, that's really nice. And then were there any pivotal moments in your research career that made you change topics, or like why did you want to pursue like the topic that you are on now?
I think there were a few pivotal points, actually probably many pivotal points along the way. When I was an undergraduate, the first thing I tried in research isn't the thing that I do now. It's something completely different. And my first research experience, it was clear that that's not quite what I wanted to do in the long run. I tried, I guess, two different things before I found something that really clicked with me. When I applied to graduate school, I said I want to enter this particular field, which is the field that I'm in now. But there was a lot of luck that happened along the way that allowed me to be successful in this particular field. As an undergraduate, I didn't know what I was getting into, honestly. I mean, I had maybe like tiny little hints, but there was still so much to learn. And there was a lot of luck involved in my initial gratification that I took from this area, eventually evolving into something that I really could enjoy doing for decades, and there's no guarantee that that was going to work out. I think pivotal moment was working with Matthew Fisher. He was a phenomenal mentor to me. There were certain times where we were working very closely together. It was very stressful, to be honest, because he was very fast and he had vastly more experience than me, and I was really struggling to keep up. But it was an amazing learning experience because I was seeing, how a master of their craft operates in real time. And that was really essential, I think, for my development as a scientist. A few years later in my postdoc, there was another key thing that happened, which was actually the result of procrastination. It was kind of interesting how procrastination can sometimes lead you to change your life. I was supposed to be working on something, and I said, I don't really feel like doing that right now. Let me go and learn about something else that just sounded a little bit interesting to me. And so I did. That thing I was learning about, I accidentally found something that I was going to spend the next 10 plus years of my life thinking about. So I would say the big picture message there is give yourself a chance to learn about new things, because if you are too narrowly focused, you may miss out on great opportunities that can be career changing, as it was for me. I didn't know, but it just happened to be that this new thing that I was learning about just captivated me. And it's not so much what I'm doing right now, but I spent a long time, probably 10 plus years thinking about that, related projects to that thing, which I had given myself the opportunity to just stop and think about.
Yeah, that's so cool. And then where do you see your research field expanding to? So, like, what are some interesting topics that can be further explored within the next, like, 5 to 10 years?
Well, nowadays, quantum science is a huge thing. There's a big global effort at building devices that utilize quantum mechanics to realize kind of grand technological goals. I would say the holy grail is building something called quantum computers, scalable quantum computers that, at least for certain problems, can solve problems infinitely more efficiently than any modern supercomputer that we have now or will ever build, classical supercomputer. So there's tons of opportunities both within industry and university settings for advancing the quantum computing frontier. There's other aspects of quantum science, like people are trying to use quantum properties to build sensing devices for various applications, detecting something called dark matter, gravitational waves, probing magnetic fields with higher sensitivity and things like this. So, my research is inching towards that more, quantum science focused realm. There's certainly a career's worth of opportunities.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like, I was talking to another professor and he was talking more about like quantum computers and how like they've made like just like really big advancements recently.
Yeah, that's true. It's absolutely amazing what people have done. But we're still, I would say, in the very early stages of that problem, in the sense that, where we want to be to make something really useful and fulfill all the great potential promise. And where we are now, there's a pretty wide gap, which is maybe, depending on your perspective, it could be good or bad. It's intimidating because the problem seems very intimidating. You want to be so far from where you are now. But at the same time, there's lots of opportunities, right, for let's say, a young person to get involved and really make a transformative shift in that direction.
And then how did you like find your passion for research and how would you suggest a high schooler try to find like their own passion in research?
Well, for me, it was again kind of accidental. I didn't know that I was going to be interested in physics, and it was a happy accident that I am. I think if you're potentially interested in research, try to find an opportunity. Even as a high school student, I mean, it may be challenging as a high school student, but there are opportunities for, let's say, having a summer research program at a university, or maybe if there's a local college or university nearby where someone lives, can try to arrange something, and maybe working in somebody's experimental lab. In experimental physics, there may be more opportunities for a high school student than in theoretical physics, just because there's less background formalism that you would have to learn to be productive. Reading books. I enjoyed reading popular science books, not as a high school student because I wasn't interested in it then, but as a college student, I read books by Richard Feynman and other popular physics books that talk some about, you can get a glimpse into what certain aspects of research is like. Maybe that life is romanticized a little bit and piques your interest in. But there's also if let's say high school research doesn't quite work out, and for most people it's probably hard to arrange. There's still college, I didn't start doing research until my junior year of college, and maybe that's a little on the late side because I shifted to physics quite late. But things turned out okay for me. Now I'm a practicing physicist at a good university. So I would just say don't get discouraged if especially I would get as a high school student if it may be hard to find research opportunities. There's still lots of opportunities that will hopefully present themselves in due time.
Yeah, okay. And then what traits do you think define a great researcher in their field? And like what type of traits would you look for in a potential lab member or collaborator?
There's various words that are often used. Grit is maybe the most succinct, but the more verbose way that I would describe it, an irrational persistence in the face of adversity. I think this is what you really need to be a good researcher. Be driven and just not want to give up. You have to be able to, keep working really, really hard at something, even though the payoff may be a little bit far away. I think all physicists that I know have this characteristic, and I think the best students that I work with have that characteristic. Of course, that there has to be other things as well. I mean, but I feel like that is the most fundamental characteristic that I think can determine one's success as a researcher, and maybe arguably success in almost any aspect of life, to be honest.
And then what kind of skills do you think a high schooler could develop, even if they don't have access to like any of the materials or computers that you guys have?
I think computer programming is a pretty handy thing to obtain proficiency at as a high school student, and that will pay dividends in physics in the long run. Yeah, it's funny because I had so little background in physics as a high school student. I'm a little bit at a loss for what's useful because I didn't have those skills myself. I know really outstanding undergraduates at Caltech that as high school students, they read the Feynman lectures. It's a series of books that just go through physics, various different topics in physics in ways that are notoriously interesting and well taught. So something like that, just getting acquainted with Feynman lectures may be very eye-opening for later parts of your education in physics if someone wants to go that route. But I do want to say that it's of course great, if you can get a background in whatever science discipline you're interested in as a high school student, but it's not essential. That's what college is about. College is about specializing and learning a craft. So even if somebody doesn't come out of high school with a deep physics background, it doesn't mean that they can't be a successful physicist in the long run.
Yeah, okay. And then just for our final question, what kind of tips would you give to a high schooler who's looking to go into research or like specifically physics?
I mean, these days there's lots of really good online resources for learning physics. You can try some of those. Ideal situation would be to try to get involved in somebody's lab, or maybe even something these days in tech companies. I don't know how good the opportunities are for physics for high school students in that sector, but could be something interesting to look into. And just don't get burned out at the same time, because college can be pretty intense, and you want to make sure that you're still energy left to pursue physics at a high level in college and beyond. And last but not least, don't be discouraged if certain opportunities turn out to be hard to come by, especially on the research side as a high school student, because those will hopefully rear their head in due time if they don't materialize at that stage.
Yeah, okay. So that's all the questions that I have for today, and thank you so much for meeting with me.